Today we're going to discuss sharpening semi-chisels and more specifically the side plate angle. Semi-chisels are great because they're very forgiving in the way that they're sharpening. You can make a lot of mistakes and they will still cut. But to get the best out of them, you really need to know a few things, which we'll go through. Let's start with the very basics. What is the difference between a full and a semi-chisel? The names at the top here are irrelevant. These are information pages from an old McCulloch manual. This is our full chisel over here on the right and our semi on the left. A full chisel chain has the top plate coming across and meeting the side plate at a square corner. Because of this, it can clear the entire width of that curve in one pass. You can see the dotted outline here of the next pass it would make. A semi-chisel chain is an improvement on the old chipper style chains. Here it's described as a semi-square, which was a common term used then. It's still occasionally used now. The difference is this rounded corner. We've increased the size of that leading edge, the working corner, right at that very point where the top plate and the side plate meet. The purpose of the rounded edge is to increase the working area of that corner. The surface area of that is very small because it meets at a fine point. By the time we're over here, we've increased the size. This allows it to be much more durable because a larger area has to dull on the corner before the chain stops cutting. Different manufacturers use different radiuses on the corner. This holds true even through the same brand in different sizes. There is many different styles. They all get labeled as semi-chisel. I did a video on this about a year ago where I showed a few different types, which I'll link up above there somewhere. The downside of a semi-chisel is it can't clear the entire width of this curve in one pass. You can see this area where it's left. It has to take several bites to clear out to the wall. That's because it continues to cut further down the side plate. Even the terminology I've used there is technically wrong. The correct way to describe this is the side plate doesn't commence until after that radius has finished. That's where a lot of semi-chisel sharpening goes a little wrong. We're going to deal with it sharpening to manufacturer specs. We need to know the angles. I'm going to explain them to you. You can sharpen differently to what we're going to see from the manufacturer's specs. It is entirely possible to end up with less side plate angle if you're aiming for more durability. The sharper these become, the less durable they are. Everything in life is a compromise. Just as this cuts slower than that, this will keep cutting a lot longer. If we take the factory angles described for a chain like this, which we'll see later in the video, and we dull that angle up, it will cut slower but for longer. Everything is a compromise. The video today, we're just going to try and get to those factory angles. So here we can see the angles, the cutter filing angles as they're described. We have our top plate filing angle, which is that line straight above the top. Most people are familiar with this. Might be 25, 35, 30, whatever. The next angle we deal with is the top plate cutting angle. This is viewed from the inside down at the very inner edge of that cutter. I'll show this up close later on. The third angle we deal with is side plate filing angle. Just to add to this, the top plate cutting angle and the side plate angle are both a function of the file's diameter and the file's height. Being consistent with these two angles is the most critical part of chain sharpening. Without the correct side plate angle, it's unlikely you'll have the correct top plate cutting angle, and vice versa. If you sharpen with a grinder, the depth of the grinding wheel as well as the profiled shape of the grinding wheel both have an impact on both these angles. It is extremely important that you are consistent with both the depth that the grinding wheel goes into the tooth as well as the shape of the grinding wheel throughout the chain sharpening. Again, these are the two most critical angles in chain sharpening. You can be off on the top plate filing angle and it will still cut. If you get this wrong with the top plate cutting angle and the side plate angle, it will have a dramatic effect on the chain's ability to cut. So the first chain we're going to have a look at is Oregon 95 TXL. It's a 325 narrow curve semi-chisel. Oregon describes it as a micro chisel. It has a smaller corner radius. The reason for starting with this chain is it has very detailed witness marks, so hopefully it can help people get an understanding. So here we are zoomed right in on it. We can see a detail in our witness mark here showing our side plate angle. The first thing we need to identify when sharpening a semi-chisel is where the side plate and the top plate actually meet. Here we have quite a small radius and we can see that fold in the cutter just below the tip of the file there. So that fold line, which is just below the end of the file there, is the start of our side plate. If we come down the side here, right there is where we commence our side plate on this chain. The specs for this chain call for a 70-degree side plate angle. Now the reason it becomes important to understand where the side plate starts is because we create a very different cutter shape if we measure it from the tip of the corner. As this starts folding over the top, we end up with a bit of a strange situation where we can see the outer edge of the top plate from the side. So to achieve this when you're using a file, you'll notice, if I just line it up there so it all fits in, it's difficult from this side, you can see how low that file's actually riding in the bottom of the tooth. This chain is not quite halfway there. We've probably used 30 or 40% of it. If we look closely at the bottom of the gullet, you can see I'm really riding low. It's quite important with semi-chisels to go down a file size. We're going to end up just taking the top out of the tie strap. In fact, I'll just touch one up and show you it from the top. Okay, here's a cutter that I've just touched up looking at it from the top. You can see where the file's just starting to hit the top of the drive link as we're going through. There's only going to be a couple more filings in this chain before I have to drop this file size. We're trying to continue to be as low as possible, so we're creating that 70-degree side plate further down that cutter. The result of doing this, especially with that angle that Oregon's describing of having the file handle down, is creating a very severe top plate cutting angle, which would be viewed from the inside. So here's that cutter viewed from the inside. As I said, I'm using that file tilt, as Oregon recommends, to create a lot of top plate cutting angle, which is that angle down through there. You can see the file resting up against it. That is where most of the cut speed is coming from. According to Oregon specs, we'll end up with about 50 or 55 degrees out here. It will slowly decrease as we go across because our file's riding ever so slightly higher because of that down angle by the corner. Our 70-degree side plate's being achieved down here below my thumbnail. I really should clean my hands for doing this. And our side plate would commence about there. We're going to have somewhere around 60 to 65 degrees of actual hook angle, I guess you'd describe it as, on the top. That is the correct way to file this chain. Generally what I see is people squaring up the corners a bit too much. I do that a lot for durability reasons on some of the bigger chains, but we're just trying to show you how to get to factory specs here. Up next we have our Stihl RM, our rapid micro. These are intermediate corner design chain, I'd describe them as. Stihl wants our file held flat when we're sharpening. They are calling for a 75-degree side plate angle. If we look at this chain, we can see the actual fold marks. Our side plate starts just below the file, right there. Our 75 degrees, if we do this right, will be down in this lower. I'll zoom right in on it. You can see this looks quite severe. It looks like a chain that has been badly hooked, but this is just how a semi-chisel looks when you go for the manufacturer's spec. If we look at our witness mark, you can actually see it curls over and just goes pretty much flat on top. That's because what we're seeing up here is actually our top plate overhanging our side. So our side plate commences just there at that fold line in the cutter. The easiest way to tell with most semi-chisels is look for this bottom fold and the next one up. Everything you see there in that radius is technically top plate. The actual transition occurs somewhere in the middle. Again, as you can see with this, you can see the gullet is pretty much completely clear. Because Stihl's telling us to hold our files flat and go in, we are low. Very, very low. You may have seen recommendations from them to hold the file so only 10% is above the cutter tooth. They did this forever. They changed it later on in life, but especially with the full-size 3/8 version of this chain, you want as little of the file above it as possible. It is in there very, very low. I personally do not like the way this cuts when it is filed to the manufacturer's specs like this. In hardwoods, I find they vibrate and carry on. In softwoods, they become extremely aggressive for a semi-chisel. Very fast cutting in greenwood. If you take a factory ground one of these, as they come when they're brand new, they cut about 20% slower than an RS or a Hexa chain. If you sharpen it like this, not the way they give it to you, but to the way they recommend, it closes that gap significantly. In softer greenwoods, I cannot tell the difference. Again, file in there super low. It looks very wrong when you do it, but this is a way to get the manufacturer's spec. While we're on about that, Stihl sells these depth gauge tools. We've probably all seen them at some stage. They're not great depth gauge tools. They are pretty good as a bar cleaner and checking groove depth on bars. What they do excel at is on the side, they have the little cutout windows. The cutout windows are for measuring side plate angles. What you can do, this is an older one that doesn't have 75 degrees on it, which is annoying. They used to recommend 80 or 85 more specifically, but you can drop this over. You'll require some good light, but if you get in there, you can actually measure your side plate angle. So like I said, our side plate commences after that first fold. If we go there, it's not 60, however that top plate coming out the side is. I may have missed when I've sharpened this one. There's probably not quite enough on that. You could probably go a little bit lower with the file. It looks very strange because you can see how much of that top plate is just hanging out the front there, but that's actually how it is meant to be sharpened. Generally speaking, I find grinders get this a lot closer than guys that file. Mostly because they're using the grinder incorrectly and they don't know any better, but by sheer accident, they can generally grind Stihl RM chains quite well. Useless fact. If you are a grinder, do exactly what most people tell you with a grinder to do with full chisels, which is technically wrong, but do it with your Stihl RM. Just cut in, put the radius of the wheel right down in the very bottom of the gullet and just cut in flat. Have a straight angle going in. As long as that straight angle stops around that fold there, by that second fold, you're fine. You can dig it in below that, have it straight back on like 60 degrees through there. It'll cut. It'll be a bit fragile, but it'll cut. Just touch on this one quickly. This is an Archer semi-chisel, definitely not one of my favorite chains. The reason I want to touch on this is it has a larger corner radius. It runs at 80 or so degree side plate. You can see that corner, that first fold occurs a fair bit lower down and it's much more vertical here. This is very common of older style semi-chisels. If you're using a 3/8 Oregon DX chain, it tends to look like this. This is because they have a large corner radius. It extends further down the chain. They do look a little strange, I guess, compared to most things, but at the end of the day, it's the same old stuff. We end up with a corner. It has a bit of a point. We've got some top plate cutting angle. It's a chain. It cuts. Don't really like this stuff. Next up, just quickly, this is an Oregon 27RA, the skip version of 27X. This changed design at some point, I believe in the early 90s. They changed the sharpening specs of this too. It got a smaller corner radius over time. If we zoom right in on it, you can tell it is very small for a semi-chisel. This chain calls for a 65 degree side plate. This is about as close as you'll get to a full chisel style sharpening apart from the Husky semis. So as you can see, this one's actually been done on a grinder, so it hasn't done the whole thing. There's still a lot of the lower in there, but you can see a very abrupt corner change. So our cutoff is that fold there. Always look for the top and the bottom fold. So between there and there, they're our semi-chisel side plates. You can see how abrupt that change is. This could actually use more side plate angle. If it was done with a file, it would look very different. It would obviously be cut out more in the lower. But that is a micro chisel 404, just to give you an idea. I'll grab one of the Husky semis next. Next up, we have our Husky S35G, 325 58 gauge semi. Husky actually gives these the same sharpening specs as the full chisel chains, which is a 60 degree side plate. You hold the file flat and go in low. When I say low, I mean really low. It has quite a small corner transition. It's very difficult to actually identify where it finishes. You need to look quite closely. You can see how severe that side plate angle is. This is quite unusual for a semi-chisel. Best advice when you're doing this is you get in low, very low. You want to go down a file size quite early on with this chain. Go down to the little 4mm files. This stuff cuts amazing. It is very similar to using a full chisel. It's quite fragile, but it does cut well. They've lent harder towards the cut speed than the durability side. So that's an example of one of them. You're going to have a lot of top plate hanging out, basically a big, big hook. So that's a basic overview of sharpening a semi. Generally, you need to be down lower. When I say lower, I really do mean it. If you're filing, you're going to be right down in the bottom of the gullet through the life of the chain, generally swapping down a file size. If this was a full chisel chain, because that side plate's up, we need to hold that file up a little bit higher. We'd create an extremely fragile chain if we did this with a full chisel. I know people like to talk about get the gullet. With full chisels, it's difficult because most of them have a reasonably tall cutter. I find people go too low and miss everything up the top. With semi-chisels, it really can just be advised. Just start in the bottom. Obviously, don't cut down any lower than the top of the drive link, but just keep running back. With this zoomed right in, we can see this fold line down the bottom of the cutter that runs from the front to the back. There's like a fold just where it starts transitioning into the tooth. Cut the bottom of the gullet to match that shape as you go back. By the time this cutter gets to about here, it needs to go down a file size and keep it in the bottom. Keep running back on that angle. The other thing I should note with a semi-chisel, if you look at it from slightly higher up, if we change the angle, as we change the angle and we get higher up, the actual shape looks less severe. That's because we're looking at the corner, the radius corner of the cutter. So from up here, it doesn't look like we have as much angle, but if you get right down low on it, it looks like we have a lot. It's just part of sharpening a semi-chisel. Hopefully some of that information helps someone. I'm not really sure. This is the first video I've done since I've moved house, so everything's a bit different. I am going to set up a proper location where I can have some better lighting and I can show more things. The other thing I'll mention is none of the filing tools available, most of the file guides, any of the flat file guides that hold the file, Husky's roller guides, 2-in-1s, etc. None of them hold the file low enough for semi-chisel chain. They will create a chain that cuts, but if you're looking for cut speed, you're going to have to go without it because you need that file lower. All those filing tools is made as a compromise. They need to be able to do both the full and the semi-chisel version of a chain. If we look at 2-in-1s, generally they lean towards being pretty aggressive on the full chisel Stihl RS chains, and they're not aggressive enough with the semi-chisel RMs. Again, they will cut, but there's a lot of cut speed left on the table with the way they sharpen a chain.